Excellent. Okay, got it. I already forget what I was saying. Oh, I was just saying thank you, Karen, for introducing me. Before we get going into anything formal, if you have any questions or comments or anything that kind of comes to you as I'm talking or as you see things, feel free to put them in the chat. I know that Karen will be moderating the chat. I'm hoping at some point she might jump in and say there's a question relevant, and I think that I'll even have some time potentially to allow you to ask your questions unmuted, so that it's not just a text question, that there can be a little bit of a dialogue instead of just me giving a monologue. I'm not much of an actor, so monologuing is not my shtick. So as Karen said, my name is David Coodin. I am a school psychologist in Seven Oaks School Division, so that's in the northern part of the city. I served 3 different schools within Seven Oaks School Division, including Victory School, which is an elementary, Amber Trail School, where I am right now, and which is a kindergarten all the way to grade 8. And I also work at Seven Oaks Met School, which is an alternative high school program. At each of the 3 main high schools in Seven Oaks School Division, we have an alternative high school program affiliated, and I'm at the one that's affiliated with Garden City Collegiate. And so not a lot of people know about SOMAT, so I like to give a little spiel. It's a very neat program. 3 days of the week, the students are in school, and 2 days a week, they're in internship placements that are chosen by and done interviews by themselves. If a student is interested in animals, they might try to get an internship at Assiniboine Park or at a veterinary clinic, et cetera, et cetera. It's an awesome little school, only about 120 kids. The kids stay with their teachers for all 4 years, and it's a really awesome place to work and get to be really, I'm a visible participant in that community, which I really love. A little bit about me. I am from Winnipeg. I went to university at McGill University and University of Manitoba, where I got both my honors degree in psychology and my master's degree in school psychology. I have a 22-month-old little boy who's right now with his grandmother sick with a cold. And my wife, Kara, is a psychiatry resident. And my father also is a psychiatrist. So we're a team, we're a family of mental health experts and education workers. I have numerous family members who also are teachers and educators. So we have fun family conversations about this type of stuff. Today, what I'd love to do is try to just have some chats, some conversations about what does a psychoeducational assessment look like, what does the process look like, as well as some of the, try to open up the doors, open up the book on what assessment, diagnosis, and all that process is, particularly pertaining to learning disabilities, so specific learning disorders, as they're called in the DSM, as well as ADHD. I'm just going to try to share my screen really quickly so that we can see this. I think that people can now see my application. Excellent. So I just want to start by thinking about how we go from start to finish in an assessment. And this doesn't even start at really the really early parts, the pre-assessment part of an assessment, the pre-referral part of an assessment. So looking at this little graphic here, there are numbers 0 and -1 and -2 and -3 and -4 that are important to talk about before we actually look at this. Most importantly, from my perspective as the psychologist who doesn't come in until steps, even sometimes even after step 1, step 2 kind of, I really get involved, is the back and forth between what a school teacher or educational assistant or administrator, learning support teacher, resource teacher, whatever term the division uses, what they're seeing in a student, what type of challenges, skills, strengths, weaknesses they're seeing, and how that relates to some of the things that we see at home. Most diagnoses, most disabilities have in their descriptions that challenges generally need to exist in more than one context. For example, if somebody is really struggling with anxiety, but it's only in one very small part of their lives, now they might have a diagnosis of a phobia if it's around going out in public or if it's about public speaking. But if it's not more broad, if it's not in more than one context, it's not necessarily something that we can kind of pinpoint as a diagnosable disorder. The same is true for things like ADHD, where things need to be seen, challenges need to be seen in more than one context, which is why the beautiful part of a school-based assessment is that the perspective of the home and the perspective of the school, which is, the two main spaces that a child who is of school age will be, can have a part of that conversation. I have done and still do private assessments, and sometimes the challenge with a private assessment is that the school side is not explained in great depth and detail in a way, because sometimes it's done during the summer, or the information, it's not as easy to gather information from the school when the school is not inherently a part of the process. So before we even get to one, the back and forth conversation between the school and home, and being honest and open about what are the things that we're seeing, is such an important part. The next is thinking about what are the very small interventions, what are the little things that we're trying to do to try to manage these things that we might try with every child before we start to get more detailed to maybe there's a disability or maybe there's a disorder that we need to start to look at. So all of those things leading up to number one happen before a school psychologist even gets involved usually. When we get to step one, that's when we get the acceptance of permission, where we say, is this something that we want to do? Is it something that the parent is on board with, or the child themselves, as especially in the teenage years, having the consent of the child, of the student themselves, is equally as important as having the consent of the parent. Then we get into the space where I and my colleagues might be more involved. And I'm not going to go into great depth about what these things look like, but there are more things than just sitting down with a child and doing testing or doing assessments, using, I see somebody's looking to get in, perfect. Using assessment tools, using forms that we fill out as their parents or teachers or people that are seeing the child on a regular basis. There are things like reviewing files, medical information, previous assessments that are really important. Oh, look, a time, there we go. Sorry about this, my room has it, there we go. Time sensitive lights. Looking at things that are not, that are written down already, and talking about, talking with the people, gathering information prior to even meeting the child, so that we have an understanding of what are the things that we're looking at. Not every assessment looks the same. We don't have a battery of tests that we say for every child, I'm going to do these three things. And that's it, that's all. I, along with my colleagues, I'm trying to count the tests in my head. I think that just physical testing kits, there's about 20 different tests that we have. In terms of forms that we fill out, questionnaires, there's dozens of them that for each assessment, it's going to be specialized. There are certain ones that people use each time, so that they're kind of a foundational one. One that you'll see quite often is called the Behavior Assessment System for Children, the BASC. And the beauty of that one is that it's really broad. It touches on everything from focus and attention to learning difficulties to aggression, to adaptive skills, to leadership skills, communication skills, etc. And then when we gather that first bit of information, we start to create a roadmap of where do we think this assessment needs to go, and we start to do different assessments. Very often, the next step might be a cognitive assessment. The most common one people see is called the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WISC. Wechsler is a brand. It is under the Pearson academic kind of umbrella. And they have a number of tests that are very well regarded, very well designed and tested quite thoroughly so that they are reliable and valid and make sense. Again, whenever we see results of test 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, the next step is based on the previous piece of information. So in the example, so let's talk about ADHD. Let's start with ADHD. If you as a parent have filled out a BASC, the Behavior Assessment System for Children, and just so you know, lots of these questionnaires, if not most of them, there is a home version, a parent version, a teacher version, as well as very often a self-report, a self version that, especially for children over the age of 10, 12, the student themselves fills out the questionnaire, or with support from a staff member, will fill out the questionnaire and answer questions about the thing that we're looking at. So if on the BASC we see a spike in the scores in inattention or hyperactivity, that would tell the examiner to look further into that, to do an assessment that focuses more precisely on attention and focus or hyperactivity, rather than having that broad test. So we kind of go broad to fine to finer to finest. What you might see next is a questionnaire like something called the SNAP. It's the SNAP 4 or SNAP 5 right now, and that's the shortened version is 26 questions. There's a longer version of at least 96 questions that kind of is much more broad. The SNAP is actually an open, accessible thing that you could Google it right now and find it. The results would only be valid when scored by a professional, but you could find the SNAP, and you can look at what those questions look like. Another common assessment tool is called the Conners. The Conners is an excellent tool to really parse out what is ADHD and what is typical or average behavior that might look like ADHD. Maybe it looks like anxiety, maybe it looks like there's some conduct or oppositional challenges, because it also looks at lots of the comorbid disorders. And comorbid means kind of if you have one disorder, that it can often be in relationship with another disorder. For example, anxiety and depression are often comorbid. Somebody with anxiety might also suffer with depression. Once those scores are, once those assessment tools are scored by the examiner, by the psychologist or psychometrist, there might be more questions that need to be answered. A cognitive assessment is not always necessary for every assessment. If you, as parents, see that your child has had an assessment and it doesn't include a cognitive assessment, that's not necessarily a bad thing. There might be absolutely no concerns about your child's cognitive abilities. It's simply that there's a hyperactivity or a focus issue that we need to kind of try to focus on. And a very important step in our assessment is observing the child. There is a reason that we don't have computers that we fill in a form and we get a number or a score pumped out, and then a diagnosis is made, because we need to use our clinical judgment as the people around the child to determine, do these scores that are stated by the parent or the child themselves or the teacher, do they accurately represent the behavior and experience of the child? And so as a psychologist, I spend quite a lot of time in the classroom or in the school community as a whole. So sometimes in phys ed or in music class, observing a child without intervening in a way. So watching without kind of engaging. Just yesterday, I sat in a elementary music class observing two students. I didn't participate in the lesson. Sometimes I will after I've kind of let them do things with me watching, and then I'll kind of get involved a little closer so that I can have more direct conversations with them. And that observation time is really the time to see them in a quote unquote natural environment. And the school's as natural of an environment as possible. It would be lovely to have observations of a child at home, but that's not always a realistic, or I've never done observations of a child at home. I've interviewed children at home, but never kind of observed them for hours or longer periods of time at home. That number 4 is the part where we do engage in norm-referenced, informal, and curriculum-based assessment. Norm-referenced means that it's been tested, and it's not just something that you go online and you type in intelligence test and up pops a quiz where you have to put blocks together. That's a good test of visual spatial abilities, but it's not well tested and rigorous assessment. We'll try to use things that have been created specifically for the purposes of assessment and diagnosis of children or adults, depending on the age of the child. Number 5 is where we get to the point where we have all the information. Now, what does it mean? Taking all of this data that we gather, whether it's through observation, through questionnaires and reports that the teachers and parents give, as well as formal assessment and informal assessment as well, taking it and saying, so what does this all mean? That's where the background, the training that we receive that is specifically for this job comes in handy to say, I have all this stuff, I have all this junk, I got to put it together to mean something. And that's why I'm not a computer, thank goodness for that, but rather I have to use the kind of the logic, reasoning, the back and forth process of talking about an assessment, talking about a student with colleagues to try to figure out there. Because again, excuse me. Sorry about that. Talking about a student with colleagues to try to get to the point where we say, this makes sense. The answer to our question is in front of us, and we have an answer. Number 6 is the boring process of writing a report and the challenging and sometimes difficult process, emotionally difficult process of giving feedback. A very important aspect of my job is something called knowledge translation. That is taking information that doesn't make sense to a lot of people because it's in jargon, it's in technical language, and taking it and translating it into consumable information, into words that make sense to everybody or to anybody who they're meant for, as opposed to words that only make sense for the people who study it every day, all day. I try my best to write reports at a reading level. Like I'll actually analyze the reading level of my reports so that it's hopefully under grade 12. Sometimes it's hard just because sometimes it looks at the word psychoeducational. It's a really long multi-syllabic word, and that pumps up my grade level. But so that it's not, I'm not trying to write a university thesis here. I'm trying to write something that is usable and consumable for the consumer. And the consumer in this case is the teacher, the parents, and the child themselves at a certain point in their lives. Sitting down and talking about the assessment is the most important part of this. I've heard horror stories of people going to an assessment meeting, an interpretation meeting as they're called, and the psychologist sitting back in their chair and reading it from top to bottom. If any of you have ever experienced that, I'm sincerely sorry on behalf of my profession. That is not how it should go. It should be a dialogue. It should be summarized. It should be understood as opposed to read to you. And in that process, hopefully information is shared in a way that is understandable to the family and to the school, and can be used to help that child move forward in some tangible way. The end result of an assessment is not always a diagnosis. Some people think that there's always going to be a diagnosis. That's not even close to true. Sometimes there are non-diagnosable disorders that you kind of say, like, this is just the reality of this student's brain, of this child's brain, and here are some things that we can do to help. Recommendations are an extremely important part of the assessment procedure, because if we just write a report and say, here's the answer, and here you go, what good does that do? We want it to go somewhere. So I'm not sure if any or all of you have assessment reports from school psychologists or from private psychologists, but I would be fascinated to know, if you happen to have them on hand, the range of amount of recommendations. There are some people, especially in the medical community, who give very, very few recommendations. 3, 4, 5, which I'm still new, I'm still young, I'm still trying to find my perfect amount of recommendations. But you'll also see people give 30 or 40 assessment recommendations. And I'll say that that's not necessarily that helpful either. Because how can you follow through on 40 things, some of which might be actually really big changes in a student's or in a family's life or in a classroom environment? So part of what I try to do is give the most relevant and specific recommendations to that specific child, and not just some generic statements that could be applicable to any student, but that it's tailored and formulated to one specific child. I am cognizant that where'd you go? You know what? I'm going to stop screen sharing just for a moment, but I want to find the chat here. So I have a direct message to me that asks, how long does an assessment take for learning disabilities? I'd be interested in, if people are comfortable, putting in the chat, if they've had a child of theirs, or if they know other people, how long the procedure took from kind of when you first learned about it till you sat down and had a report in your hands. If anybody is comfortable to type that into the chat, that would be fantastic. I'd really appreciate it. And before I give an answer, I'd love to see some people's answers, so I'll wait just a moment. But that question has a long answer. That there's a long and a short answer, and I'll give it in just a moment. And it's a question that I talk about a lot, especially with one specific colleague of mine, in terms of how long does an assessment take. So a colleague and I, last year, we were having a chat. I think I was bemoaning the fact that a colleague, a staff member, was asking about length of assessment. Or maybe it was a parent who was frustrated. I've got Christiane here said 3 half-day sessions to complete the WISC and Wyatt. Okay, so that's just the in-person part. So that's quite a bit. Like that in and of itself, just that hours of time there, that's, that's already a chunk. So from start to finish, my colleague Daniel and I were saying that an assessment could take 5 days, or I think it might have been 10 days, or it could take 10 months. There's kind of, we joke that there's no in between. 6 to 8 hours total. Okay, that's a great number. the reality of working in a school setting is that our job is not exclusively assessment-based. As a school psychologist, I do everything from assessments of learning disabilities and ADHD, et cetera, to classroom programming for classrooms that are having some challenging behaviors or situations that the teacher doesn't necessarily know how to manage or talk about. And so I'll go in, so I'll talk about everything from consent with our middle schoolers about sex and drugs and et cetera, to feelings, emotions, et cetera. We have programs that we do for little kids and for older kids as well. To helping teachers with specific teaching skills, because I'm not a trained clinical psychologist, I'm a trained school psychologist. So part of my training involves best practices in education, not just assessment, but also how to best relate to children, how to best relate things like math and English and French and music, etc. But there are some things that I've been taught how to do that I'm not a teacher, but I've learned and researched the best methods that are proven in different ways to be really helpful. So you can have a situation where you have an assessment where other priorities, other things within a school environment, other things within a school division get in the way of that assessment taking, just the 10, 12, 15, 6 to 8 hours, according to Casey here, that those hours get so spread out amongst the school day, for example, or a school year, pardon me. I am at 2 of my schools only 1 day a week. So even if an assessment took a total of 15 hours, in theory, that could take me 3 weeks of work. But the reality is that an entire school day is not always spent on a single assessment, that I have a whole number of things that I have to do, including boring paperwork, to make sure that all of the students that I support and the teachers and administrators that I support are getting what they need. Generally speaking, I try to make sure my assessments take no less than 3 months. I'm often doing more than one assessment at once at a site. For example, I am just finishing an assessment report. I actually just wrote the last recommendations today that I began in June. And because it was a late in the school year, the family understood that I wasn't going to finish before the summer break. And I was hoping to finish before October, but because of other things that, wrenches get thrown in the plans, I'm now just finishing and hopefully having a meeting to go over those assessment recommendations next week. So yeah, what is that? That's 1, 2, 3, 3.5 months of time in school plus the summer break. But sometimes if things can be a priority or if things are calm on our time, it could take a month. The time is so varied and so variable, especially in saying that not every assessment looks the same. I'm seeing somebody whose name is not Zoom, but their Zoom name is Zoom, that lists other things than the WISC and WIAT that should be included in an assessment. So I did talk about I talked about the WISC. The WISC is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and that is a cognitive assessment that is very, very, very often used in a psychoeducational assessment, especially if there's concerns or questions about cognitive abilities or a learning disability. It's not always used if the concerns are more behavioral. And the WIAT is also from the Wechsler family, the Wechsler Individualized Achievement Test. And the WIAT is an academic achievement test. So it is, if you were to picture all the little quizzes and tests that you did in school, whether it's a math minute, a spelling test, writing an essay, etc., it's a compilation of that type of task, but norm referenced. So as I stated before, the norm reference means that thousands and thousands of people have done the assessment, and their results are taken and looked at together, as opposed to just 20 kids in a classroom. You take thousands of pieces of data and you say that, okay, so we can actually see what is the average for this age group or for this situation. So a child who is struggling with academics, instead of asking the teacher, what grade level are they reading at, the WIAT will actually give you a really research-based and formalized statement on this is their grade level of reading. And it will break it down even further. It's not just reading, writing, math, or something to that effect. It might be reading comprehension, or word reading, or how are their skills in timed mathematics, or in oral mathematics. So asking a question and having them respond, and that's a different skill than having a child sit down to a pen and paper assessment of mathematics. And just to answer the question more specifically, I guess, to did you list other things? The WISC and the WIAT are really common. I talked about the Connors, which is that ADHD scale, the BASC, the Behavior Assessment System for Children, which is a very broad behavioral assessment. There are dozens of things, and I'll send a link in the chat, or I'll send one to Karen that shows a whole bunch of different assessments that psychologists often use as it relates to what are the challenges presented. By that I mean, if the question is, does this student have autism? I wouldn't necessarily, the first thing I'm going to do is not necessarily a cognitive assessment. I might try to answer that question, and if I'm seeing something that is more than just a question around autism, I'm going to delve deeper into those things. So you'll see things like autism rating scales, visual motor integration assessments called the Beery VMI. Sometimes you'll see projective tests. I don't do a lot of projective testings, but some psychologists love projective testing just to kind of have a baseline. There's a number of speech and language assessments that both speech and language pathologists, as well as some psychologists, will do to have an understanding of their expressive and receptive vocabulary and language, because those might be something that are interfering with the academic or cognitive portion of a child's functioning. I'm seeing another question here. This is great. This is great. I tried not to over prepare so that I could answer some questions. So Christiane asked to review the diagnostic criteria for learning disabilities. So her son has ADHD, and the cognitive assessment and academic achievement assessment scores showed high to extremely high in everything except for reading and writing, low average. So report says he does not meet diagnostic criteria, which makes it difficult to access supports through school. So learning disabilities, and this kind of gets to the fun part of learning disabilities. The DSM, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, that is kind of the Bible of all these different psychiatric and psychological disorders that over the years has been built to have a agreed upon definition of what is or what isn't a disorder according to the medical and psychological community. And we can have a whole new conversation and lunch and learn about labels and diagnosis. I'm not going to get into that right now, but the purpose of a label is to access resources. A purpose of a diagnosis is so that organizations that require some form of cutoff can know which children, which students, which adults meet the criteria for this thing. So the learning disabilities aspect of it is probably the most challenging portion of diagnosis. If you were to Google right now, learning disabilities diagnostic criteria, you're going to find 1,000 different criteria. The DSM-5 criteria are accessible and available to you. to look at and to read through. But the problem is that that's kind of not agreed upon by everybody. The Learning Disabilities Association of Canada has a definition, the Learning Disabilities Association of the United States. There's a really good one that I'll link to the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario. That's kind of the one that in my training we went through most specifically. That basically states the old model of for learning disabilities was average to above average cognitive abilities. So as a quick review or learning piece, cognitive abilities is kind of the built-in stuff. It's not stuff you learn. It doesn't change that much over time. It is your ability, it's your brain's ability to process visual, verbal information, having working memory, so kind of hearing things or seeing things, using those things really quickly, processing speed, and ultimately getting what we might call an IQ score. So that's cognitive, so an average to above average. And so that old model was the discrepancy between that and somebody's current achievement in an academic setting. Meaning, if you have really strong cognitive abilities overall, but very weak academic abilities, that used to be great learning disorder next. Now that's not quite as simple. It's not as quite as simplistic as it used to be in that way. That is still a model that some people will consider, and it's an important consideration to kind of see, but that's not now an absolute yes to a learning disability. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to bring up the DSM-5's learning disability criteria right now, so that we can just take a quick look, so that we can have an understanding of what does it mean. So let's share screen. So this is coming from the American Psychiatric Association, so a well-respected and revered organization. It's not controversial at all. And so in the DSM-5, the newest version of the DSM, learning disabilities are encompassed by what's now kind of termed specific learning disorder. And within that is a number of different categories of impairment. So down here, impairment in reading, commonly referred to as dyslexia, impairment in writing, impairment in math. And so you can see down here, there's some terminology stuff. And so much of our world is wrapped up in semantics and terminology, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm going to kind of interchangeably use the term learning disability, specific learning disorder. In this context, we're going to say that all kind of means the same thing. So the DSM criteria are actually right here. The first being difficulties in specific areas. So reading, understanding what's read, difficulty with written expression, mathematics, etc. So number two is kind of what I described with regards to the differences in cognitive abilities and the academic achievement. So have academic skills that are substantially below what is expected of the child's age and cause problems in school. So if a 15-year-old is reading at a 6-year-old level, or if a 12th grader is reading at a 2nd grade level, that kind of fulfills this number two part of the diagnostic criteria. Number three is just stating that it happens during school age, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it continues all the way through your entire life. Most people who have a learning disability, it will persist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. And the last one is one of the most important things that I don't think lots of people have a full understanding of when it comes to diagnosis of mental health disorders. It's that the learning difficulties are not due to other conditions, such as, in here, intellectual disability, so low cognitive ability and low adaptive scores, a vision or a hearing problem, a neurological condition, adverse conditions, which is an interesting one that we could go down that rabbit hole. It says lack of instruction here. That's not the wording in the DSM. This is not a direct quote, but This is an important one, especially right now in conversations around COVID, which this is another massive topic that we could spend an hour talking about, which is the instruction that has been given to the child sufficient? Did they have the opportunity to learn? For example, if a child comes to me and they're in grade 6 and they're reading at a kindergarten level, but they've attended school 10% of the time since kindergarten, can I diagnose a learning disability? Probably not. I almost certainly won't, because have they had sufficient and meaningful instruction? Probably not. They've missed too much school. Or in another situation, if they've had a really, really awful teacher. And that's not something that happens very often. I'm going to say that I think that many, many teachers, most teachers in my schools are wonderful. But there are situations in every profession, there are people who don't necessarily do their job very well. So if you've got a terrible teacher for 5 years, can you say that they've had sufficient and meaningful educational instruction? Not necessarily. So this aspect, especially now with COVID, right, is the instruction, or has the instruction digitally, virtually, has it been up to snuff? I'm not going to say yes or no, but it definitely throws a question mark into this idea of lack of instruction. So with regards to Christiane's son, not knowing everything that is going on with the child, I'm going to try to get myself back into stop sharing. Not knowing everything that's going on, especially with untreated ADHD. And this is actually something that I've been very focused on the last couple of weeks because I'm dealing with it quite a bit. I use the analogy of, imagine going and taking a test. Think about any test, and your cat just died, or you just got broken up with, or you're suffering from severe depression. Doesn't matter what test it is, you're probably not going to score as well as you would if the conditions were, I'm going to use the quote unquote normal. If you're going in with a full belly and you're going in hydrated and you're going in with a relatively positive outlook on life, that means that the results of the assessment are not necessarily valid. Now think about going to school for 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, and experiencing symptoms of ADHD, meaning that, are you able to take in the academic instruction at all times in a meaningful way 100% of the time? And not that anybody can experience that. 100% of the time is not a realistic expectation. But I have students that, in my estimation, are attending focused 25% of the time. So in a 10-year school career, they, in theory, could have missed grades worth of instruction. And therefore, is there sufficient instruction? Not necessarily. So when you're impacted by other mental health or medical disorders, you can't necessarily make a diagnosis of another disorder, because we always try to use the concept of what is the easiest, easiest is not the right word. What is the best and simplest explanation for a problem? If a plumber goes in and sees there's a leak, they don't necessarily immediately say there's a problem at the city level, or there's a problem. They have to find what is the quickest and easiest and simplest and closest problem to where the problems are being seen. So Christiane, I'm not going to say one way or another anything about your son, because I don't have his assessment report in front of me, and I don't want to step on any toes of any other psychologists. But an important aspect is not just that they meet the criteria that's laid out in the DSM, but that last one of it can't be explained by something else is a very, very important aspect of my work. And I really have to focus on, is what they're saying or what I'm seeing because of X, Or is there a better explainer in Y and Z? And therefore those need to be taken care of before we can even think about diagnosing or dealing with it. I am cognizant of the time. And I see this is perfect. I was going to say if anybody has any more questions, I would love for people to throw them out and I'll try to answer them. I would love to answer questions quickly. I'll also say in advance that I am also very happy to have dialogue with parents, something I've done as a volunteer for LDAM, having conversations over Facebook Messenger or even Zoom one-on-one. If people are interested, please feel free to reach out in the later days afterwards, and I'm happy to have individualized conversations. But I want to touch on Colette. Colette, you asked, do you think that kids who do not make grade level consistently are worthy of an assessment? First off, I'm going to take umbrage with the word worthy, but well, again, not going to have a semantics conversation. Every division and every school team and every psychologist will have a different philosophy on who receives an assessment when. Sometimes the history of a child's academic experience doesn't get taken into account for when an assessment occurs. Sometimes it's just, we have to think about timing, we have to think about use of resources. We, as a psychology team here, where there's about 10 of us, we regularly talk about what are the optimal times for doing assessments. Some people say there should only be 2 during a school career. Some people say there should be 3. Some people say it doesn't matter the number, it should only happen when they're necessary. I don't have a really strong opinion or belief. My belief is that, especially when done using school resources, which is somebody like me, assessments should be done when the school team needs support to have an understanding of how to best educate a child. For example, I just had a parent request an assessment for a sibling of somebody that I had done an assessment already. She said, you know, my son is struggling, their doctor wants an assessment. And I said, great, I don't know, let me talk with my colleagues. So I spoke with the learning support teacher here at Amber Trails just this morning and said, you know, and I'm using a random name, you know, Jimmy's mom wanted to know if we could do an assessment for Jimmy. And the learning support teacher, my friend John, said, look, I've known Jimmy for 6 years. His teacher knows his situation. They're really well equipped to currently provide educational, geez, is that number 3 or 4? I think it's 3. Knows how to best teach Jimmy at this time. So John said, I don't think we need an assessment right now. And I said, okay, that's great to hear. We agreed that, you know, Jimmy's a grade 5. It might be important to have an assessment, pardon me, for his transition to high school, because our school goes all the way from K to 8. So when he transitions from our school to his high school, the people over at the high school level who haven't had 6 years, 5 years, 8 years of experience with Jimmy might need some more information, standardized information, to have a better understanding of how to best teach him. There are reasons to do assessments beyond just educational planning purposes. And sometimes that takes precedent over educational planning. Sometimes they know exactly how to teach this kid, but the family is in desperate need of support, or there are major mental health concerns, and we might do an assessment. So just having and if I'm looking at your questions, and if I were just to really pick it, people who maybe just have grade level consistently, or who are below grade level consistently, that might not be sufficient to push you over the edge to say, yes, we need an assessment. but it might be necessary as a one piece of information to say, this is really helpful to know, therefore we're going to do an assessment. So Colette, and I want to speak directly, Colette, does that make sense? Do you have any follow-ups, or have I answered the question that you've asked, or have I gone off on a tangent like I often do? Great, yes, that's helpful. So Karen, I'm kind of at the end of my spiel. I really appreciate everyone's questions. I think it's really helpful to have questions directly from people who have experiences with these assessments, who've gone through assessments either with their children or with themselves, so that this process isn't scary. It's not mystical. It's not fancy. It's really helpful and necessary, and sometimes really important for the well-being of a child and their functioning at home, not just at school. So Karen, I think I hear your microphone, so I really appreciate the time and the ability to be a part of this lunch and learn.
Thank you so much. I know that this is a topic that we often get calls from parents and families about, and demystifying the process, if you will, and helping people understand it is so important and helpful. And I just want to also thank you for your offer once again. I know you've done it previously, but just even helping parents make sense of assessments when they get them, getting another opinion, or talking parents through things as a
Yeah.
volunteer with us is so it's just such a wonderful resource to have, because we don't have the opportunity to access psychologists through our service. So thank you
Yeah.
for still continuing to do that for us.
And and Karen, I'll mention that for those of you who might be or not be on the Learning Disabilities Association Manitoba's, I think it's the parent Facebook page, I am on there. So if there are two things: one, you can post questions or things in there, but also feel free, if you find me in there, I'm there. It's my normal name. I think the picture of me is of me as a very young child with my two sisters. So if that helps, feel free to send me a direct message if you'd like to chat. I'll say that again, it is on a volunteer basis, and I do my best not to step on the toes of my colleagues, but to give honest feedback and maybe some recommendations of resources that you might not have heard of before, that might be helpful for your child.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this week. It's been wonderful to celebrate Learning Disabilities and ADHD Awareness Month this way. Take good care.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.